Well, I forgot I have a lavalier mic. Thank you all very much. And don't you all look splendid from my vantage point up here? It's the lights. It's not the lights. You all do look splendid. So I'm going to get right to there's no preamble to this constitution here. I'm going to get right to the point. To give an account of racism is very, very difficult because race as a concept was actually formed it was introduced into the English language around 1580 and was used interchangeably in the 16th and 17th century in a way that was synonymous with ethnicity and nationality. And then really began the journey of race as a concept really took off in the mid-19th century with the expansion of empire and slavery. And with the rise of genetics, the field of biological anthropology has since dismissed the notion of race as a scientific category as false. That is, when you subject all the racial taxonomies to philosophical and scientific meaning tests, biological anthropologists and scientists in general have said that it is a social construct. It is not a biological category. So I'm going to give really a talk on a couple of things. One central topic, which is it moral to really hold a racial identity? And racism and racial identities are subsumable, I think, under a much larger phenomenon, which is known as tribalism. So to give a talk on the history of racism would be to presuppose in some sense that one is talking about a form of irrational discrimination, which is what racism is, which did not exist before the 16th and the 17th centuries, which is putatively false. So I think tribalism has been ubiquitous since inception of humankind. And so when we talk about racism, I think we have to remember that what we're talking about in some sense is a phenomenon known as tribalism. I've written a series of 3 books dating back 20 years ago when my first book was first written in 1999. That's more than 20 years ago, actually. And I would describe tribalism as the exclusive organization of one's comprehensive identity around a set of non-moral characteristics shared by others, which constitute the identity of the group and around which one experiences a deep sense of self-identification and agency. So I know that you've all been sort of spoiled rotten by the marvelous but and in-depth presentations yesterday. But with the PowerPoints, I have no PowerPoints. I have a sustained argument that I want to give. So I'm going to ask you to employ the Randian virtues of concentration and focus, where Rand defined concentration as sort of the undivided attention on some particular task or goal. And I think focus is a sort of goal-directed mind committed to grasping a full awareness of reality, a mind that is committed to grasping, understanding, and knowing. So I'm going to pose something that's quite radical. I'm going to say that to be radical, rational individualists, we have to become race traitors. That sounds radical, because I've seen too many individualists who hold tenaciously to strong racial, ethnic identities and have some part of their individualism eviscerated of the dignity that I think is possessed by one who's really a rational individual. So I'm going to talk about what I call the rational transracial race traitor, who's a radical individualist, who does not hold to strong racial, ethnic, or national identities, which I think are largely destructive of one's agency. So to pose a question, is it even moral to practice a racial identity? I need to get into an analysis of this. And I think to position oneself in such a way is to position oneself as what I call a metaphysical rebel in the world. So let us begin the task of analyzing the moral status of holding internal racial identities as part of one's self-image. It is only then, I think, that we can explore the radically free metaphysical rebel, the heroic, rational, transracial race traitor, who can usher in what I call a new planetary ethic, a new manifest destiny, actually, for America, and an aspirational model on which to base his identity. And what I'm calling for is nothing short of the revocation of the individual's membership in his or her race that one never asked to belong to. So when one admits that one is a race man or a race woman, regardless of racial descriptive identity, one is confessing that one exists, I think, in a mummified state, that he is bearing pride in being a hermetically sealed phenomenon, closed off from the world. He has recused himself from a large portion of membership in the pantheon of the human community by, in some sense, using criteria that are irrelevant when it comes to moral agency, and that actually a concomitant of holding that identity is othering the other, othering people, demonizing the agency of others. So I think that holding a racial identity is problematic because it turns one into a practicing racist. So white supremacists of all stripes, people who are members of black separatist groups, whether you are a member of any kind of ethnic or racial particularist group, turns you into a walking racist. And we have the Nazis and their North American counterparts, and we have those today who, people like Ibram Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates, who I take as black national separatists, whom I would put in the same category, that are wedded to a political ideology that demonizes ethnics and other races. So I'm going to go much farther, however, in the scope of my argument to suggest that the concept of race itself is bad. And the concomitant practice of holding a racial identity voluntarily and living one's life as a raciated creature is what Ayn Rand would call is a form of biological collectivism. And one is acting as a racial subjectivist. It doesn't matter whether one is black, white, Indian, or a member of any other designated group. The principle that binds all racial identities together, what is called polylogism, is identical. To self-referentially hold a racial identity is to collude with, I think, a great social evil. And again, this doesn't matter if one is a member of a minority group, let's say one is black, without the political means to institutionally discriminate on a large scale. It diminishes the scope of one's socio-political reach, not the fundamental nature of who one actually is. So, as an antidote, I shall posit the identity of the individualistic, rational, transnational, or transracial individualist who I think conceptually has a more robust moral identity as a competitor to the race man or the race woman. I think Cornel West is wrong when he says that blackness is an ethical identity. For reasons that I shall give a little bit later on, I think blackness is a conceptually vacuous term. It constitutes what we call in logic an empty set. Compared to whiteness, the practitioners of which have sociopolitical power to enforce institutionalized racial discrimination. Blacks who are racial practitioners become petty racists, who, like the holders of all strong racial identities, are racial codependents. But even those today, like people who are advocates of critical race theory, who attempt to make whiteness into a legitimate concept that designates specific attributes shared by all whites, short of the putatively obvious one, which is skin color, have failed all meaning tests, which is why the claim to abolish whiteness, I think, is really a euphemistic term to annihilate all white people from the face of the earth. All right, so when I talk about the race traitor, the transracial, radical individualist, I'm talking about somebody who's a lover of humanity, but not indiscriminately. I'll get to that a bit later, what constitutes the robust identity of such a person. His identity is a moral competitor to racial identity, which by nature are exclusive and arbitrarily discriminatory. And so the transracial individualists cleanses the individual of the empirically untenable and largely imagined attributes one is deemed to have, and which, unfortunately, one has falsely adopted as a proper designator for who one is. Concomitantly, transracial individualists correct the empirically false beliefs that race consciousness generates about the moral and metaphysical status of individuals because of their racial identities. So racial markers are conceptually ambitious in that they purport to convey information about persons that, if taken seriously on the conceptual level, would yield necessary and sufficient conditions that all persons falling under the category would satisfy. Now, the extant literature on why race fails as a biological concept, as I said, is well established. What survives in the public imaginary, however, are attributes that are taken to have moral salience, which are applicable to persons designated by historical and biologically fabricated markers. So sociological studies on the formation of, for example, European ethnic identities reveal a broad swath of traits that Europeans, some of whom, like the Italians and the Irish, were not considered white early on in the late 19th and 20th century, held about other groups and they believed them to belong to other races. And those traits, ranging from productive, smart, God-fearing, clean, and efficient, to low, lazy, dirty, cognitively immature, and irredeemably evil, were allocated among the various groups of ratiated individuals, with those assigned the most negative traits falling on the lowest registers of the prestige index. A morally salient fact about holding a racial identity is, I think, that one must engage in what Aristotle called affected ignorance or willed self-deception about oneself and about others. In the face of competing evidence, one holds certain views about oneself and about others that are causally linked to a form of racial subjectivism. The latter holds, among other things, that certain attributes one deems praiseworthy or laudable because one has them, and one has them because these attributes are causally primed by having the racial identity one has. Now, the logical inverse of this form of reasoning is that if others have those attributes that are racially primed within themselves, they must have them accidentally, incidentally, do not have them at all, or at best have them imitatively. So whites who have a strong racial identity and predicate white superiority on advanced cognitive function that is treated as an irreducible primary because of its statistical consistency across a white population, especially when, say, compared to the cognitive functioning of non-white populations, must engage in empirical obfuscation to maintain a psychologically consistent view of themselves over time. This self-cohesion depends on the willful distortion of the agency of others precisely because of imagined attributes the demoted group has that the superior group cannot logically have. Now, the inverted reasoning of such individuals who hold a strong racial identity would seek to identify those who lack advanced mental functioning as simply a failure to exercise an innate personality within them. At the same time, let's say blacks who display cognitive superiority are merely aping the behavior of whites in whose image they have fashioned themselves, and this is what is called white normativity. But the moral ambitiousness of racial designators is not to be found in the attempts of its users to function like epistemological and conceptual wholesalers in the realm of locating moral agency within racial registers. There is no robust theoretical claims that can be made about moral attributes if they're ever indexed to racial identities. Now, the moral ambitiousness of those who utilize racial designators involves bypassing the claim of empirical untenability on the individual level. That is, some members of the demoted race, in fact, are smarter and better than they are. That certain members of the alleged superior groups are cognitively inferior, and certain members of designated inferior groups have cognitively superior members become irrelevant. The racially and morally ambitious practitioners, what do they end up doing? They end up disambiguating the individual from his own cognitive register and wed his overall moral efficacy and superior status to his associative relationship to the group. So let me give you an example. A moron in the alleged superior group is not only less of a moron, But speaking in terms of the aggregate, he's not a moron, since his character is appraised against the highest denominator or normative features of his group. The essential defining characteristic of his group is predicated on superiority, genius, articulacy, productiveness, cleanliness, efficiency. Inversely, the cognitive superior person in the low prestige group, let's say because black identity has always occupied the lowest prestige group in the history of America, is always adjudged by the lowest common denominator in that group, which is taken as a definitive feature that he and all members intrinsically hold, despite individual exceptions such as himself. Nothing in human reality could explain why, for example, the English had held steadfastly to the view that a colonial subject, regardless of how well he mastered the English language, how respectable he comported himself, how impeccably he dressed, and how well he executed the most exquisite members in the public sphere, could never be English. I am not adducing myself as evidence of this at all. I'm not English. I'm Jamaican by birth. What makes holding a racial identity highly problematic is that it is a form of biological collectivism, as I said. And according to Ayn Rand, which I'll get into her definition of it a little bit later on, biological collectivism is not a variant of racism as much as it is a species of tribalism, of which racism is a concrete manifestation. Any attempt to identify a human being in morally significant ways based on his or her genetic lineage was bound to be a form of evil, even if it falsely ascribed positive traits to a group without the concomitant damage to another group. It would be an evil because the individual willfully commits an error of evasion. In doing so, he fails to properly distinguish himself from animals by invalidating the specific attribute which distinguish him from all other living species, that is, his rational faculty. One chooses chemical predestination, a form not just of biological collectivism, but of what I think Rand would call abject mysticism over individualism, and chooses ascription over achievement. As Ayn Rand famously articulated, racism is a crude form of biological collectivism, largely because the appeal to innate ideas which form the racial template of persons living to racial ideology betray free will. As a result, this appeal to innatism violates the concept of the individual as volitional, one who is morally responsible for the creation of his or her virtues, and those who seek their deepest sense of identity from race approach the subject of virtue as if it were an inheritable trait. And the reduction to animality, personally, is not what I believe is inherently objectionable to racist ideology, nor even the violation of the principle of individualism. It is bad because it is one of the lowest forms of irrationality one can descend to. It makes irreversible the idea of inherited vice and discounts virtue in the person who has cultivated it on his own, but whose ancestors are given credit for the moral achievement. It deprives the individual of the exercise of reason and the inalterability of character traits through blood is established as an ideal. One gets life, what one deserves, through the mystical mixture of blood and bodily fluids. This biological collectivism trades on associative identification as a shortcut for earning and arduously maintaining identity as an individual. To be a biological collectivist means that one rides on the prestige of one's tribal, racial, ethnic, or national identity, suffused with the moral attributes of everyone but oneself. In this sense, holding a racial identity means that one is morally lazy. Inversely, those who hold strong racial identities make individuals into biological collectivists by judging them according to a racially subjective algorithm whose formulae are the actions and attitudes of others who are codified and given a racial denotation. This racial denotation becomes a metaphysical template that is the foundation of all racial stereotypes. And what makes holding a racial identity in the cultural or biological sense morally problematic is that one makes not just a shortcut to achieving a moral character. Instead, one engages in the appropriation of characterological traits of one's ancestors and relies on a specious form of chemical predestination and associative identification to cultivate a sense of self-esteem and moral self-worth. The moral untenability of holding a racial identity is brought into sharper relief if we go beyond the fact that it breeds a form of moral laziness because it disincentivizes one from cultivating an individually constructed moral identity by riding on the social prestige of one's ancestors and deriving self-esteem and moral status from associative affinity. This simultaneously this, as we have seen, arises simultaneously from psychologically and existentially attenuating the agency of those outside the sphere of the extolled group for the enhancement of one's racial prestige. Moral laziness is a direct corollary of the act of valorizing ascription over achievement. The construction of race, the greatest ecological, or tribalism, I would say, the greatest ecological disaster of the modern world, has afflicted many human casualties and moral harm, whether one relies on a racial identity to feel a sense of belonging or a misguided sense of false pride from holding such an identity. It becomes irrelevant, I submit, that any ethically minded person who holds a strong racial identity ought to strategically give it up out of recognition that racial worlds are inevitably warring worlds. Strong transracial individualists have as their goal the complete deracination of peoples of the world in the psychological and moral sense of the term. Suffice it to say that strong racialists suffer from the metaphysical concomitant of any variant of biological collectivism, tribalism, which manifests itself in an inability to create a moral and independent identity of their own, separate and apart from the codified records of their ancestors and current racial compatriots. Here we find what I call racial narcissists who suffer from a chronic inability to stand on their own without the buoyancy of racial uplift. The hold of a racial identity is mired, I would argue, in a form of what I call psychic infantilism. He is unwilling or unable to matriculate outside the protective patronage of the tribe, and as such remains cognitively in a state of arrested development. He is an unfortunate simulacrum of the original image of those who had constructed him as the racial archetype he spent his life rejecting, or, as in the case of a racial majority, that constitutes itself as a normative standpoint of human aspiration. He's a bloated caricature without personal worth or value. The transracial race traitor is what we may term an event-making individual. He is a social disruptor, an existential game changer. Eventually, he determines a course of history by human consciousness along an evolutionary path. He perceives the deepest anatomical and genetic structure of what racial identity really is all about, and he sees that it was forged in the crucibles of contempt and degradation. He identifies what I call the zoomorphic and bestial nature of it from its inception and the qualities of inferiority associated with it. He sees the lies on which it and all racial identities are predicated. In the spirit of Jewish theologian and philosopher Abraham Heschel's distinction between process and event, or transracial, I'm trying to get rid of cultural nationalism here, and I'm invoking it on the stage, or transracial individualist hero intuits that he has been living as a process herd creature. A process is a phenomenon that happens regularly. It follows a basic permanent pattern, while an event is something that happens only intermittently and occasionally. Events are emergent and they are rare phenomena. Now, to live as a process, a person as a process person is to be typical. To live as an event is to live as a unique being. Nature is comprised of processes in the form of organic life, such as birth and death. And history consists primarily of events, of anomalous, surprising acts and achievements that distinguish one human from another, and ultimately usher in a new paradigmatic manner of living. So I would describe our heroic race traitor, who is a transracial disruptor, as a disputatious hand-me-down, who betrays a disputatious hand-me-down racial identity that is divisive and self-destructive. And he pursues a higher, more austere morality that secures his self-esteem and allows him to view the world without dust, to see clearly the manifest souls and human identities beyond the fabrications of race, ethnicity, and nationality. The virtuous transracial individualist will have no historical or biological racial identity. Rather, they are orphans forged in the vectors of their own moral imagination and an exalted vision of life's most reverent possibilities that will give rise to a tumultuous and binding revolution of the soul. They have given birth to themselves and have chosen to be born. That is, the accidents of birth, bloodline, parents, and family are what I would call journalistic minutiae. They are incidentals of history and largely irrelevant in the face of what lies ahead, the future, and the attendant emergence of moral beings. This radically autonomous, sovereign, and self-transcendent being lacks biological or historical identity. To lose the entirety of one's ancestry is not a tragedy, but a necessary forgetting of where one came from in order to authentically recreate oneself anew, to genuinely be the author of one's identity. The virtuous transracial race traitor has renounced heirship, legacy, and racial heritage. They never chose them, and since they were bequeathed to them without their permission, and they cannot claim to love them because they did not have anything to do with them, they were foisted upon one. Racial, ethnic, and national identity have to be appraised and evaluated against the backdrop of their emergent value schema. Such individuals do not worship the family, the tribe, the race, the state, the nation, and they hold no value higher than the naked, tribally unadorned singularity, the self that presents itself to them in its indubitable singularity, I should say. I'm about to wrap up because I want to hear your questions. I have much more to say, but I will say that tribal markers nationalize the souls of human beings by sheer force of the ubiquity and the totalizing narratives that reduce all members of a tribe to a one-size-fits-all metric of appraisal. Regardless of your evolutionary experiences in the world, no matter how your growth has changed who you are and migrated you beyond the party lines of tribal rhetoric, your indubitable nature as an individual is rapaciously deprivatized. It is robbed of its luminous singularity. Imposed on it is a generic agency devised from a one-size-fits-all script that is a repository of stereotypes, caricatures, and untold myths that purport to predict your future actions, interpret your past, and deny you the full reality of your present experience. This script authenticates you by virtue of how closely you adhere to the consensus among its adherents, whose numeric preponderance constitutes evidence of the truth or falsity of your behavior and actions vis-a-vis the sacred script they have devised. The script robs you of your glory and democratizes it by appropriating your achievements and turning them into collective tribal property. But the transracial individualist identity is a weaned identity. There are those who will argue that my viewpoint is unrealistic and impractical, but to hold a transracial identity is to be removed from a deep sense of who a person makes him or herself out to be. Morality is a very demanding enterprise, and its function is not to mirror what we necessarily desire on the spur of the moment, because unlike friends who we see sometimes as clones of ourselves, morality cannot reproduce images we wish to create to assuage the fears and insecurities of modern life. No moral system can entreat its students to aspire to the best and highest form of living if it does not demand much of them. Step by step, we create a future that is ours to behold. And the future is ours because out of our broken souls and past, we look up and we see a vision, not just of life's better possibilities, but the other half of ourselves that have been left uncultivated, uncorrupted, and untouched. Free and living in that space of individualism, of radical love, the virtuous man or woman, holding no racial, ethnic, or strong tribal identity. As his standard bearer, stands confidently with palms facing the universe and declares to the world, I have no history. I have no race. I have only you and the future. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed that. I'm not really sure how to ask this question, so let me,
Just
as
ask it,
concisely as I can, stumble through it.
but be brief.
I once recently read that 19th, 20th, and 21st century Western civilization is a flight from reason. And part and parcel of that flight from reason is the elevation of racial identity to the moral forefront. And what it amounts to is we are going to recognize and practice the virtue of racial identity in order to end the evil of racial identity. Comment on that. That's my understanding of what I have read and what I have deduced from that. It's a naked contradiction.
Yes, it is a naked contradiction. And Ayn Rand had a very famous saying when asked, how do you beat collectivism? She said, you never replace the poison by adding more poison to it. I absolutely do not know how to make sense of that statement. Gloria gave a wonderful talk yesterday about the complexity of Western civilization. When we talk about the West, there is the bad side of the West and the good side of the West. As a professor of 25 years in the classroom who's taught the foundations of Western civilization, going back to the libraries of Alexandria and working my way all the way up to the Enlightenment period, I see the West as a magnificent journey of 4 steps forward, 3 steps backward. And I see the Enlightenment period predominantly as that period which began the process of deracinating the world through the projection of the idea that reason, well, it really began with the Stoics, but the Enlightenment philosophers were the ones who tried to institutionalize it through the brotherhood of science that saw no color, that through something like reason, an assured moral purpose in reason, the centrality of reason that could adjudicate among all truth claims that all persons had a share in, that could rise above something like race and ethnicity and conjoin human beings in a proper moral purpose, united in reason. So I think Gloria was right when she talked about using Western civilization as sort of like a blanket term. I would sort of, with laser precision, point to the Enlightenment as that period when this nonsense about using racism to fight racism, I don't know what to make of that sort of that form of conceptual inanity. But the Enlightenment period is a period that I would point to in history when the journey towards universalism among all persons began. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
My first question is it collectivistic to love the culture you grew up in, which may or may not be attached to a skin color, but is attached to to your family? 2, how do you become race traitor when you exist in a society that's very racialized and that affects you concretely. 3, was it hard to become a race traitor?
Well, to answer your question, guys, you can see that I'm wearing my American flag quite proudly. I'm a patriot who loves this country, but like Rand, I love this country. Thank you. She would use the word not causelessly, not mindlessly, not like some mindless flag-waving jingoist, however you pronounce it in American, jingoist or jingoist. I never get the pronunciations right. But for rational reasons, I love America more than I love my own country, which I don't really care too much about. I always felt like an alien back there. I felt quite ill-suited, and I feel quite gold-suited for America. Because I love America for rational reasons, because I chose to be here. As far as family, I'm not a sentimentalist. I despise my father for reasons which I won't get into. I loved him when I was a child. I grew to despise him as an adult for the person that he became and the way that he treated me. I'm not particularly close to my brother. I have some sort of fraternal affection for him. I love him in a sense. I'm very close to my mother. I love her. But to answer your question, I'm someone who constantly praises, and this is one of the questions I wanted to ask Craig yesterday, given the contextuality of values. I'm someone who constantly appraises take an inventory of my values, and I subject them to rational scrutiny, and I appraise them. And those values that don't pass the meaning tests, Jason Hill's meaning test, which is not a form of subjectivism, but is governed by logic and reason, they go out the door. And I acquire new values to replace them. So I have no use for, like Rand, I have no use for cousins, aunts, and sub-cousins and sub-sub-cousins and the plethora of the family tree, because they hold no value to me. I mean, I have nothing in common with them. I wrote it, my second book was called Beyond Blood Identity, Post-Humanity in the 21st Century. That was written, let me not do the math here, I mean maybe 14, 15 years ago, I don't remember. But it spoke all about giving up this attachment to blood because it gives one a sense of security.
I'm lucky enough that a lot of my family members happen to be blood, but I know that's not the case for everybody.
Right.
I wanted to ask about, I'm thinking about I'm a teacher, I'm thinking about what my colleagues would say to this talk. And I think about 5 years ago, because things have gotten much worse in the last 5 years, but about 5 years ago, they would talk about how color blindness is an ideal, but given the state of our society, it's currently unattainable. And so the argument is that I think that they would say is that the lived experience of being a person of color is such that you can't escape that, and so it's all well and good for you to say, give up, be a race traitor, give up, but if everyone else is imposing that on you, right? Again, this is I think the argument that they would put forward. If everyone else is imposing that on you, it's not. You can do whatever you want inside your own head, and try to be as transracial as you want. But if everyone else is treating you differently because of the way that you look, then it's kind of out of your hands at that point.
No, it's not.
Okay.
No, it's not. I mean, so I have no problem being described as black, and I identify as black because that's the way America describes me. I did my DNA. I'm 43% African, 42% European, 10% Pakistani and East Indian. I'm a mutt. My grandmother had a Sephardic Jewish father, and so I mean, does any of that mean anything internally to me? Hell no. I could care less. It does not, for the simple reason that many people in my university, because I'm radically pro-Israel, unapologetically so, and have written in favor of Israel, regard me as an Arab-hating, genocidal war criminal, which they've called me and censured me for. Do I then now internalize that as part of my viewpoint? This is what Rand calls being a second-hander and what Sartre would call being a second-hand consumer of values. There is an objective reality against which to appraise that which other people regard me as and that which my self-image corresponds to. I look within myself and I realize that racial descriptive identities are empty sets. I hold a very, very strong moral identity. I hold an identity which speaks more robustly to who I am as a person. And that's my everyday walking reality. I'm more identified as a philosopher by my values, by my convictions, than any sort of makeshift racial identity, which is an empty set. There's nothing to it other than the color of my skin, which, have you looked, it's not all that black, right? It's brown. So again, this is why racists are psychotics, because they misperceive reality on the color level. They call people who are black, whose skin color is not really black. They misperceive reality on every single fundamental level, on the character level, on the skin level. So they're social ballasts, and we should just ignore them. And the people in your department sound like a bunch of woke supremacists.
Thank you.
I suspect part of my question was asked already, but I formulated this question. I came up with an answer in my mind, and I'm going to try to ask it in a way that suggests the answer that I came up with.
You're dealing with a philosopher here. Very, very careful.
Pardon?
Tread carefully.
Some people choose, for reasons not related to morality, to honor or observe or preserve their some aspect of their ethnicity. And they don't let that define them as any better or worse. I taught for 6 years on, they called themselves Indians. I guess they're Native Americans or whatever the proper term is. They called themselves Indians in North Dakota. Some of them chose to dress up in traditional costumes, do traditional dances. I thought it was beautiful, and then they were normal individual people by day. And where I live, we have things like German Fest, Polish Fest, Festa Italiana. Are those things harmful if they're not done for the purpose of saying, I'm better than you are?
No, those are just merely sociological details about a person's
Oh,
life.
great.
And the participation in them. Don't we all like ethnic foods? I've been to 35 countries across the world, and my favorite food is, besides Jamaican, Indonesian food and Indian food and Chinese food. And,
But keeping a,
right? So we want to keep those sorts of things alive.
Okay.
The fact is that, and isn't it ironic that the participation in many of those differences are what unite people together? How wonderful it is to go to Bali, where I've been a couple of times, or Singapore, and see a multiplicity of different individuals united around a meal. However, when we begin the process now of metaphysically imbuing that with more significance than it just is, it's just a meal.
Thank you.
And start saying something like, because, thank you, because I am the creator of this meal, or because my people created this meal, then I somehow metaphysically wield a hatchet or a sense of superiority.
Thank you.
That's a different
Excellent.
issue. You got me, good.
If an individual were to have a very strong racial identity and then do as you say and give it up, one could imagine that they would lose a lot of what they thought was their identity. How would you recommend that they fill that gap in the way that they see themselves?
By cultivating moral virtues.
Yeah.
Hi. A version of my question was kind of asked already. A lot of the peoples who have been persecuted or they perceive persecution in their cultures, I feel like that leads them to develop a racial, religious, or national identity of some sort. And I empathize with that, even though I disagree with it. So correct me if I'm wrong, the way to reach them or convince them that this is not a healthy psychological state of being that would never happen on a collective level. That would have to be on an individual level, and every individual would have to think for themselves and change that mindset themselves, correct?
Well, I would ostensibly point to Martin Luther King as an example, as someone who happened to be black, but who used his identity as a standpoint of advocacy, right? He never, unlike someone like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King never appealed to any kind of intrinsic sense of blackness. Notice that Martin Luther King, whether one agrees, he was one of my heroes, whether one agrees with his political philosophy, Martin Luther King took himself to be speaking for working class white people, against the war in Vietnam, the poor in general, the disenfranchised, the disenchanted in general, those who lived on the periphery, on the margins of society. His blackness or his race, which is why you can go to the Czech Republic, where I have been going since 2000, and or Poland, and hear gay and lesbian students in Poland singing "We Have Overcome." How beautiful it is to hear students singing a song inspired by a Negro spiritual. So I think that one doesn't necessarily need to lapse back into something like the univocality of an ethnic or racial identity. One can use it as a standpoint of advocacy and invite it and use it as an invitation for others to come in, as opposed to as a standpoint of excluding others. And I would just say, look at Gandhi and look at Martin Luther King, two individuals Gandhi used the principles of satyagraha as an invitation where the body was used as a meditative site of suffering to visit moral shame on those who brought harm to the Indian people. But it wasn't meant to exclude others. It was meant to invite metaphysical speculation on the plight of Indians who were colonized by the British.
Thank you.
Hi, my question is on, I guess, the topic of black culture.
Of what?
Black culture.
Of what?
Black culture.
Yes.
The reason why I ask is because I've heard that many don't think that such a thing even exists. Part of the reason because a lot of people think that there's no such thing as white culture. For example, there's British culture and French and American, but there's no white culture. So therefore, shouldn't there be no black culture? But at the same time, I feel like there's a reality-based reason why there is a such thing as black culture and in America. And I was wondering if you do think there is such thing as black culture.
Yeah, I do, because for particular reasons, that is that black individuals were distinctly marked off and were subjected to forced exclusion, unlike the Native Americans who were subject to forced assimilation. The irony is that blacks were subjected to, we had a system of white supremacy in this country, let's be very clear about it. We're not a white supremacist country anymore, thank God. But we did have a system of white supremacy which subjected blacks to forced exclusion. And blacks were forced not to be participants of the larger mainstream of American society and forge a very rich and dynamic culture. One just has to look at the Harlem Renaissance and just look at the major contributions that blacks have made. And so there is a proper insignia or imprimatur that we can stamp on a certain aspect of American culture and call it black culture, that now fortunately can be morphed into something called American culture. There's so much more I could say, but I just want to be very brief. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Thank you for your clarity and precision.
Thank you.
I really appreciate that. As you were discussing these issues, what occurred to me is there's the whole issue of culture, which is really the issue, and people coming from different cultures, and to the extent race is associated with that. People tend to pick up the attributes of the culture, the values of the culture as tribalists, as non-thinking individuals, and how to parse that and how to communicate that, certainly developing moral virtue and doing independent thinking. But to talk to that in this context, I think that's the art that we have to develop in order to improve things. And, how to do that. You're an academic, but how would you do it in the more public sphere too? That's the challenge I see.
Right. And I think something like comparative studies I think cultures are different, right? So I think comparative studies of different cultures and drawing the best in the belief systems and the values of different cultures that we can learn from. There's much to recommend in other cultural systems. I mean, we're not, the West is, and that's the beautiful thing about the West that I love to tell people about the West. The West has become the West because going back to the libraries of Alexandria and looking at the civilizations of Mesopotamia and so on and so forth, the West has become the West because it has drawn from the best of various cultures. People think that the West is just this sort of mummified, ossified, hermetically sealed thing. Unlike more homogenous cultures like Japan that sealed itself off for a long time from the world, the West has become the rich phenomenon that it is precisely because it was an explorative, some would say rapacious, culture that did intermingle with other cultures.
The melting pot, the
yeah.
crossroads of civilizations,
That's
all
right.
that stuff. Yeah. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
And first of all, thank you for being so generous with your time today as to provide such a useful perspective that I believe will be very useful for me and for the overwhelming majority of the people here going forward.
Thank you.
And my question, well, it starts with, I don't know how unusual this is going to make me seem, but when I'm watching
just be
TV,
unusual.
for example, when the advertising breaks come on, I actually pay attention to the commercials that come on. And what I'm and I believe TOSCON 2019, the talk on advertising, is to blame for this. I pay attention to not necessarily the products, but how they are selling themselves. And I don't remember specifically if I would have seen the commercial for Ancestry.com very recently, but it's reasonable to expect that I could have seen it, this past Monday or Tuesday. And the way they advertise themselves is providing the stories of your ancestors. And I think it's kind of sold as if to allow people to kind of piggyback off the accomplishments of those people and earn some sense of pride off that. And I'm wondering if you could speak to that at all.
Well, it's hard to tell because I'm not a statistician of people's attitudes and mores and how they think of themselves. I will tell you an interesting story that I was sharing with my friend Marshall yesterday when we had lunch, that a lot of Southerners are scared. And I lived in the South for 8 years when I first moved to America. A lot of Southerners are very scared of taking it. I spoke with a Southern friend who took it. She's as white as they come, blonde hair, blue-eyed. And she took it and she said, I have 10% African-American ancestry. And I said, how do you feel? She said, I don't care. But she said, I have other friends who took it and they found out that they're white, blonde hair, blue-eyed, and they have 15%. And they're traumatized. One of my friends said, what am I going to tell my children? I said, tell your damn child that he's an individualist, that he's an individual, first of all. So a lot of Southerners are, which tells you something about my talk, right? That people are deathly afraid of finding out something because they've just inherited what? A low prestige identity. You're part black. Oh my God. I'm not as Scandinavian or I'm not as Finnish as I thought I was. I got some black in me. Oh, that means I'm dirty, I'm solid. That's all I'll say right now because you've got somebody behind you.
Thank you for the talk.
Thank you.
I was thinking about theater of identity and in general.
What kind of identity?
Theater of identity and in general artistic expression based on, the sense of a people or whatever existing concept of race there is and how that's been experienced in one's experience of society. I was wondering what do you think the role of that artistic expression is in this process of sort of self-determination?
I'm not sure I understand your question.
Sorry, artistic expression based on one's experience with whatever the racial.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes. This is I hate this. Yeah. Oh, so if you're black, you can't. Standpoint. Yeah, I hate it. Like a white person can't write about a black person, or a black person can't write about a white person. This is terrible. This is a form of identity politics. It's crazy. Some of the greatest works of literature. Think of Henry James. We got 5 minutes. We're gonna do it. Think of Henry James, who wrote, The Portrait of a Lady. Think of Gustave Flaubert, who wrote Madame Bovary. Think of all the great writers who wrote. Think of Brokeback Mountain, directed for heaven's sake by a straight Asian man. Right? We are losing the richness of our heritage and of our moral imagination by sort of saying that if you're a straight white woman, you can't write about a black trans woman. That's what moral imagination is for. Let's talk about this. We're killing off imagination. we are siphoning off the creativity and the souls of people, and through political correctness and the perniciousness and evil of identity politics. Yeah. Gloria.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk, and thank you for the reference. And I wanted to ask you, regarding ancestry, what do you think about ending racism one spit at a time? Because if white people are finding out that they are black and they go, like, oh my God, no. What about black people that find out that they are Latin American or Native or Asian? Don't you think that science can be a wonderful tool, not to victimize ourselves from where we come from, but because we are all a melting pot, and all this racism one spit at a time?
I think that's a great question. Gloria, right?
Yes.
Yeah, Gloria. Yeah, of course I know you. Yeah. I'm petrified of getting your name wrong. I think this is wonderful, and I think the Z generation, if any of you are in here, I have some sort of cortical oddity when it comes, because I teach the Z generation. I think they are going to be the pioneers of this. And they're going to coin the neologisms, like how Tiger Woods coined the term Cablinasian a couple years ago. I think the Z generation are the most progressive ones in a good sense of the term. They're going to say, look, I'm mixed. I've got some Asian and some black and some white. How dare you call me this? I'm going to come up with my own terminology, and I'm going to debunk these codified terms that have existed. And I think it's with the help of science that this is going to come about. So I want to talk so much more about this because I've written about it, but so we can talk about it after. I'm determined in these 5 minutes we're going to get through these two questions.
My question is about victimization or victimhood and reparations, and I would not apply for any reparations, even though I'm the proud bearer of 0.8% Nigerian blood. Okay, but class action lawsuits are one thing when there are a lot of individual victims who get together for leverage to try to get something in return for harm that's been caused. But what about the whole idea that the American taxpayers are now the deep pockets, or are being targeted as the deep pockets for all of this supposed harm that has to be repaid somehow? All of us individuals are being lined up to be victims to repay all this supposed harm.
There's a shortcut. My book is coming out in October. It's called What Do White Americans Owe Black People? Racial Justice in the Age of Post-Oppression. It buries the reparations argument completely, which I'm against, because the majority of white people today, their ancestors came after the Civil War, and even if their ancestors owned slavery, so what? What does that have to do with you, the individual? It is a pernicious form of I won't even say reverse, it's a pernicious form of discrimination. So buy my book, read it. It has all the answers in there. It's clear, it's concise, it's precise, and it's brilliant.
I just want to say, I applaud you for having the courage to talk about this, whether you're black, Pakistani, or white. Even
You
if
can
you're
call
white.
me black, it's fine.
I mean, it's very hard to talk about this issue today, but you're clearly an intellectual and very, very smart. If you were just going to your local school board and say why we shouldn't have critical race theory, do you have a elevator speech you could give to us to be able to have the courage to stand up and talk about this issue?
I would start off by saying that look at children and how they play with each other. They're colorblind, and that critical race theory is a divisive, monstrously evil, divisive rhetoric and ideology that pits races against each other by telling the story that skin color is intractably and inherently the criterion that causes all kinds of inequalities among people, when that is just not the case. Not all income disparities, not all inequities are traceable back to racism. That is the long soundbite I would issue to the school board. Thank you very, very much.